Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour we're going to spend some time really focusing on the person of Jesus Christ. Now, of course, that's kind of the foundation of our faith. But I want to do this in a way that not only is an encouragement to you, but maybe passes on some ideas about how to use this in evangelism, in witnessing, and other kinds of things. I'm going to be taking a fair amount from a book that came out a number of years ago called Jesus: Why the World is Still Fascinated by Him, written by Tim LaHaye. And the reason I want to use that is that not only was that just a very interesting book, it's almost a coffee table kind of book, but it spends a little bit of time, as we will hear maybe in the first segment, talking about why Jesus. That's a very important question that didn't used to exist so long ago. If you were a Christian, say 100 years ago, and you're sharing your faith and you're talking about the Bible, you're talking about Jesus, people will be going, okay, well, and they'd either agree or disagree. What I began to run into when I was speaking on college campuses, and I run into now more and more just everywhere, is the reaction from especially those who are not believers as to, well, why? Why should I care? I mean, why should I be interested in Jesus rather than, say, Buddha? Why should I be interested in the Bible compared to, say, the Bhagavad Gita? For that matter, why should I be interested in any religion? Because one of the fastest growing demographics today are what are called the nones, people that say they don't believe in God. So they claim either atheist, agnostic, or no preference. So it does seem to me that one of the things that Tim LaHaye does early on in the book, which is really kind of the subtitle of the book, Why the World is Still Fascinated by Him, is to ask a very important question. Why Jesus? I mean, if you deal with some of the material that he has there, it's interesting because if you think about it, truth is stranger than fiction. If you look at this from a secular point of view, have an individual who is a young carpenter from a relatively obscure village who then goes on to be the most influential person in all of history. And for the next couple of minutes, I want to give you some kind of talking points on that, because even after he is killed, he has had a profound impact on the world. Now, I'll use the numbers that Tim LaHaye has in the book, but you can come up with numbers that are comparable. And that is, he says, it's estimated anywhere from 70 to 100 million people believe in such a story right here in the United States. There are about 2 billion people worldwide who call themselves Christians. That doesn't mean they're all born again, hardly. But they still believe in the story, and a good number of them have staked their eternal destiny on that. So that's kind of interesting in its first step. Then when this book came out years ago, Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins were on because they'd had some best-selling books on with Larry King. And even Larry King said things like, I'm not a believer, but I do have the utmost respect for Jesus Christ. I believe he was the most influential person who ever lived. And if you think about this and then start looking through history, it's probably fair to say that about 13 billion people that have lived on this earth at one point or another have existed, and maybe even more than that, but we'll use that number for just a minute. And you have to ask yourself, why is it that this one person, Jesus, has drawn so much attention? And you can begin to describe that in so many different ways. Inspiration for literature. Think of all the books written about Jesus, but also the others that have Christian themes. Music. Think of all the music that either had Christian themes or was influenced in one way or another by Western culture, which was, of course, influenced by Christianity, and the art world and those kinds of things. You have millions of churches around the world. You have a calendar which was set to what at the time was thought when his birth was. The two biggest holidays that you still see worldwide are Christmas and Easter. And so in some respects, you have to say that he has had such an incredible influence in terms of our history. What about his influence in philosophy? I love this because, again, Tim LaHaye documents that you can look at other philosophers from Confucius and Descartes and Hume and Kant and Rousseau and whoever it might be. Still, Jesus has such a profound influence. Just take the Greek philosophers. Really, when you talk about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, their careers total about 150 years. And yet, Jesus Christ, in many ways, is more influential than they are after having a public ministry of a mere 3.5 years. When you look at print, you see the same sort of thing. Even critics have to admit his influence. H.G. Wells, of course, is known as the author, for example, of The Outline of History, and was an outspoken socialist and a promoter of Darwinism. Yet when he wrote his Outline of History, he devoted a staggering 41 pages in his historical treatment to Jesus Christ. Plato, by the way, gets a 2-page mention. For those of you that are old enough, remember your Encyclopedia Britannicas. Again, they document that when we used to have those Encyclopedia Britannicas, 21,000 words in the Encyclopedia Britannica about Jesus Christ, the largest biographical entry of all. And then you can take some other individuals, literary figures. Mark Twain in Innocents Abroad said, "In the starlight, Galilee had no boundaries but the broad compass of the heavens, and as a theater met for great events, meet for the birth of a religion able to save the world." Then you think about even in the news magazines. You go right now, I've noticed one news magazine's got a picture of Jesus on it, and if you take Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News Report, as well as other magazines, the picture of Jesus shows up so many times in many of those news magazines, articles about Jesus in the newspaper, and those all, I think, illustrate, again, the profound influence. And even those that challenge the claims of Jesus Christ or challenge the Bible, whether it's the Da Vinci Code or misquoting Jesus by Bernard Bart Ehrman or people like that, you certainly see that. How about the movies? The Da Vinci Code I mentioned a minute ago, The Passion of the Christ. So many significant ways in which our culture really has, in many ways, illustrated the fact that if you really want to be an educated person, you need to know something about Jesus. And I think that becomes a really good entree into a society today that says, I can live my life without looking at the Bible. I can live my life without even checking out who Jesus is. I think you could point out to any fair-minded individual, they really do need to figure out who Jesus is and really need to make their peace with that as well. So what I want to do is when we come back from the break, really ask a fundamental question that Jesus asked is, who do you say that I am? You might remember that here he takes his disciples to what's called Caesarea Philippi, and he asks them, of course, 2 questions. And they're in the presence of all these pagan witnesses and things like this. And so, first of all, he said, who do men say that I am? Of course, you get all sorts of different answers and everything. And finally, he says, who do you say that I am? And so that's the question we want to put on the table here. When we come back from the break, begin to look at some of the evidence that we have for the claims that Jesus makes, for the fulfilled prophecy in his life, for the miracles he performed, for his parallel to many other things in the Old Testament, and then, of course, end with the idea of the resurrection. So some of this will be familiar territory. Some of it will hopefully be new. I will always try to have enough basic information that if it's the first time you've understood it, you'll understand it, but also have enough in there that even if you're a seminary professor, maybe you'll say, I learned something new. Let's take a break. We'll come back and begin to look at the evidence for the deity of Jesus Christ.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Although America is certainly a divided nation, the divisions between the various tribes are not as great as you might be led to believe. Yes, the social and political debates are loud and intense, but the fringe, rather than the mainstream, gets most of the attention. A study done by the group More in Common discovered the hidden tribes of America. The researchers discovered that a small group of the liberal wing and a smaller group in the conservative wing are the ones who consistently shout, post, and vote, while the rest of America is mostly exhausted by all the rhetoric. Here's an interesting contrast. On the one hand, these two groups hate each other and disagree with each other on just about every topic. On the other hand, they're very much alike. Both groups are mostly white, educated, and politically active. They always vote and give time and money to political campaigns. But here is the relevant fact. The two groups combined only constitute 14% of the American population. In other words, 86% of most of us watch and listen to these two groups argue and criticize each other while ignoring the many points in common we might have. This shouldn't be a surprise to you if you've been listening to my commentaries for any length of time. In the past, I've talked about various points of agreement. For example, Dirk Phillipson made the argument many years ago that you could fill a room with Tea Party members, Occupy Wall Street activists, and concerned Americans and find agreement. He says you would find people concerned about concentrated power, out-of-control change, and concerns about a government that no longer represents the people. After this divisive election season, we need to find a way to bring the American people together. We won't bring people together if we let the two fringe wings of the political spectrum dominate all of our discussions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again while we talk about the deity of Jesus Christ and how to use this in a witnessing context. I certainly do encourage you to find some of the material we have on our website. And let me also mention again that a lot of what I'm taking comes from today, the book called Jesus, Why the World is Still Fascinated by Him by Tim LaHaye. And one of the chapters we want to look at is All the Signs Point His Way. And part of that has to do with the issue of prophecy. I have talked about prophecy and messianic prophecy in more detail, so I thought I will summarize this. But before we even get into that, let's just think about the nature of prophecy. Because in the Old Testament, you were supposed to be 100% accurate. Biblical prophets were that way. Tim LaHaye talks about the fact that we have Madame Helena Blavatsky, who was an individual who was very influential in the 19th century as an occultist. And in some respects, the organization she worked with kind of founded some of the ideas which we today call the New Age movement and used this idea of clairvoyance and channeling. But was she 100% accurate? Obviously not. I think you would know a lot more about her if we did have any kind of accurate predictions being made by her. Edgar Cayce is another one that he mentions here, the so-called sleeping prophet, who was an American psychic and taught while in a hypnotic trance on all sorts of subjects like reincarnation and astrology and things of that nature. And then, of course, you have probably one of the individuals that I hear mentioned every once in a while is Nostradamus, born in the 16th century, late part of the 16th century, in 1503, and actually gained some fame for his book about prophecies. But they were so kind of bizarre that it's really hard to even read into any of them whether they accurately predicted what was taking place in the future. And the few times people have held out that one of these prophecies of Nostradamus is a good example that he was a prophet, you can point to all the others that make no sense at all. And I won't go into all the details, but simply to come back and recognize that one of the best arguments I can make for somebody as to why they should pay attention to Jesus is that you have prophecies written down in the Old Testament that were literally fulfilled in his life. And one of the best arguments you can make for why a person should read the Bible is the fact that indeed 1/4 of the Bible, actually I think people have calculated about 27% of the Bible, when written, was prophetic in nature. That means that we have more than 1,000 plus prophecies that have now been already fulfilled. Some of those have to do with messianic prophecies. Others have to do with Tyre and a variety of other cities and things of that nature in Babylon. But nevertheless, we can see that because these prophecies have been fulfilled, I think we'd have confidence that future prophecies will be fulfilled as well. One of the books that I have on my shelf, and I also have a digital copy on my laptop computer, is a book that was put together by J. Barton Payne. It's entitled The Encyclopedia of Biblical Prophecy, and there it actually lists the 1,239 prophecies in the Old Testament and the 578 prophecies in the New Testament for a total of 1,817 prophecies that encompass about 8,300 different verses. And so if you want to look more at the issue of prophecy, there are certainly some excellent books that have come out to actually deal with that. And I might mention that this idea of fulfilled prophecy really validates the Bible itself, because if these were accurate, and these are accurate according to what we can test in terms of history and archaeology, then other things which we really can't test, things like the attributes of God, the existence of heaven or hell, maybe we can believe those as well. Just this last week, I was talking to an individual that was asking about that. What does this idea of fulfilled prophecy actually do to help us? And I said, well, it helps us show that indeed the things that we can test and we can verify, as well as the historicity and accuracy of the Gospels, the book of Acts and things like that, show that it is a historical document, because we really don't have any way scientifically or historically or even archaeologically to verify some of the other things that I just mentioned, like the attributes of God. So we can trust that based on the fact that what we can test is verifiable. And so, again, it's just one more argument to suggest that a fair-minded individual would certainly want to spend some time looking at the Bible and investigating Jesus Christ. Since I have talked about Messianic prophecy, I'll go through this fairly quickly, but again, it's a good review, especially if you haven't had a chance to hear that, because what we can see is that these prophecies in the Old Testament were understood at the time to actually be important. For example, you have the story of Simeon, who's anticipating the arrival of the Messiah, because he knew that there would be a Messiah coming, and then he was granted the opportunity to see the babe, of course, and that is where we read in Luke 2:30, "My eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared." And then, of course, we have a lot of prophecies starting in the book of Genesis. We have Genesis 3:14 and 15 talks about the Messiah being born of the seed of a woman. And then later you even have in Isaiah 7:14 the idea of the virgin birth. And, of course, that's fulfilled, we see in Matthew chapter 1. We have the prophecies that give us the genealogical lineage of who indeed Jesus is, that he would come from Shem, because there was Ham, Shem, and Japheth, so it sort of eliminates 2/3 of the population at that time. Then Abraham, that narrows it down even more so. Jacob, well, you have Jacob and Esau, so that cuts it again. Judah is just one of the tribes. 11 of the 12 are eliminated, if you will, all the way to David in Isaiah 9. And you see why it, I think, was so important for both Matthew in Matthew 1 and Luke in Luke 3 to put those genealogies in there to show that Jesus indeed did come from the line that the Messiah would come from. Of course, we've also talked about the fact that when you go to Micah 5:2, it talks about the fact that the Messiah would be born in this small town of Bethlehem. That, of course, is fulfilled in Matthew 2 and Luke 2. And then you also have the statement in Hosea 11 that the Messiah would come out of Egypt. And in Matthew 2, we have the story that Matthew tells us of Joseph and Mary and Jesus actually fleeing to Egypt and eventually then coming back to their home in Nazareth. And then, of course, you have this idea that before the Messiah comes, there would be a forerunner. We see this in both the books of Isaiah and Malachi, and that's fulfilled in Luke chapter 3. And then we have a very specific prophecy about when indeed the Messiah would come, that there would be 69 weeks of years or 69 sevens of years from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. And that decree comes in 444 BC and is actually fulfilled in AD 33, which again is just a very clear indication that Jesus is that Messiah. And then the prophecies dealing with his crucifixion, his execution, if you will. We have in Zechariah that he would be pierced. We have in Psalm 22 the very powerful phrase, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" In Psalm 22 also that they would divide his garments. And in Psalm 34 that there would be no broken bones. And so all of that fulfilled in the crucifixion of Jesus. And then in his burial, you have this statement in Isaiah 53, verse 9, that his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death. Certainly he is crucified with the wicked, and he's placed in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. We read about that in Matthew 27. So you have just an incredible number of prophecies. Some estimate 333 prophecies. Some come up with a number over 400. Depends on which ones you link together as related prophecies. But as I've shared on this program before, even trying to come up with a few of these by accident and saying, well, he just, in a sense, got lucky and actually was able to fulfill some of those just by chance, doesn't make a great deal of sense, because Peter Stoner, in his book, Science Speaks, just goes back and looks at 8 of these messianic prophecies, the one in Zechariah and a couple of others, and asks, what is the reasonable probability that an individual by chance could actually fulfill just 8 of those messianic prophecies? And he comes up with a number of 1 chance in 10 to the 17th power. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about some of the miracles, because Jesus not only appealed to the fact that he fulfilled prophecy, but also that he performed miracles before those individuals. But as we wind down this particular section, let me just encourage you again to visit our website. It is www.pointofview.net. Click on that donate button so that you can make a year-end gift and help us out financially. And, of course, if you would like to talk to someone, of course, the number is 800-347-5151 for your pledge. And, of course, if you'd like to write to us, the address is Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. We do need to hear from you, and if you can help us out financially, these kinds of programs certainly will continue. So we want to partner with you, and we want to encourage you to give to this ministry so that we can continue to proclaim the name of Jesus, which is exactly what we're doing here today. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net, or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again as we are talking about the deity of Jesus Christ. A lot of this comes from a book called Jesus, which is written by Tim LaHaye, and the fourth chapter there is entitled Miracles, Who Else Can Do These Things? And so I thought for just a minute, as we talk about some of the arguments we would make to our friends, coworkers, and just even individuals you might meet in some kind of evangelistic opportunity, to talk about miracles. And one of the things I've noticed is that most Christians say, well, I'm not going to talk about miracles because after all, a person who's not a Christian, a person who does not believe that Jesus is the Son of God, a person that does not believe the Bible is going to accept these miracles. And my response to that, and I think Tim LaHaye does a good job of that, is saying, well, first of all, when Jesus walked on this earth, one of the things he said testified to the fact that he was sent by the Father were those miracles. So the first issue I was going to point out is that that's what he used to actually verify his testimony. And more importantly, the fact is that even the skeptics had to acknowledge something. They said, well, he must have power from Satan or something. I mean, because they recognized that something had happened that they could not explain. Here is an individual that in their village had been born blind and is now able to see. Here is an individual that was never able to walk, who was lame, who's now walking. And so, if nothing else, I think talking about miracles, even if some people might disagree with it, is certainly something which is validated in the Bible. And I think is, again, just another one of those important arguments for the deity of Jesus Christ. Now, you can really divide the miracles down to kind of 5 categories. So I'll give you a sample of each. And that is, first of all, the power to manipulate natural laws. Number 2, the power to replicate items. Number 3, the power to cast demons out of people. Number 4, the power to heal all manner of diseases. And number 5, the power to raise the dead. And again, we see that especially in the Gospel of John, a real strong focus on this idea of miracles. In John 3:2, for example, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. And in John 5:36, for the very works which the Father has given me to finish, the very works that I do bear witness of me that the Father has sent me. So others said that about him. He said that about himself. Well, let's look at the first miracle. Of course, that's the miracle of manipulating matter, and that took place at the wedding in Cana. We read about that in John chapter 2, 7, verses 7 to 11, changing water into wine. And so that is one of the miracles we run into. The next type of miracles is the power over nature. Now, we see this in a number of cases, but let's just talk about one where there is this incredible storm there in the Sea of Galilee. And in Matthew 8, it says that Jesus rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was great calm. Just again, the surprise on the part of the disciples that he had such control over the forces of nature. And then on 2 different occasions, we see that Jesus was able to multiply things, that is, feed a multitude of individuals supernaturally. Matthew 14, with feeding of the 4,000, the feeding of the 5,000, done in 2 different venues to 2 different audiences. And again, something which those around are astonished because they recognize that there is not enough food, as he even asked Andrew in the next town to feed these people, and that is able to feed them all at that particular point. Of course, we have the casting out of demons, which are fallen angels. We see that first encounter in Capernaum in Mark chapter 1, verse 23, but you have other cases where that takes place as well. And then, of course, we have the healing touch of Jesus. For example, he would touch a leper in Mark 1. In one case, in Matthew 8, he just merely speaks a word, and the miracle takes place, as he did for the centurion's servant. So again, we have all sorts of categories of individuals that were healed. Now, on at least 4 occasions, we have a place where the Messiah had the power to restore sight. And it's interesting because some looking back at Isaiah, where it talks about him providing sight, the assumption was always made that this only applied to spiritual insight. But again, whether it's in Matthew 9, the 2 blind men, a blind man in Bethsaida, in Mark 8, you have some examples again of curing blindness at that time. And perhaps the most dramatic miracles, if you will, are the places where Jesus actually raised someone from the dead. You have the raising of the dead man in Luke 7. You have the daughter of Jairus in Matthew 9. And, of course, perhaps the most famous is the raising of Lazarus in John 11. So a couple of very significant examples of raising the dead, which, of course, we'll get to in just a minute when we talk about him coming from the dead as well because of the resurrection. But I thought I would also go to one other chapter which is in the book, because this, I think, can be a very effective witnessing tool when you spend some time talking with Orthodox Jews. It's chapter 5, and it's called The Greatest Prophet. I've mentioned this before on the program, but let me come back to it again, because without a doubt, one of the most preeminent heroes of the Jewish faith is Moses, of course. And there's a prophecy about Moses and the future Messiah. It says in Deuteronomy 18 that the coming Messiah would be a prophet like Moses. As a matter of fact, the Talmud refers to the Messiah will be the greatest of future prophets and have a spirit like Moses. And so one of the things that's very interesting is Timothy on 12 different places talks about the uncanny parallels between Moses and Jesus. Let me mention them real quickly because they are significant. Both men, for example, spent their infant years in Egypt. Both men grew to become tremendous leaders, teachers, and prophets. Both men fasted for 40 days. Both men delivered the law from a mountain. In Moses' case, it was Mount Sinai. In Jesus' case, it was, of course, the Sermon on the Mount, or you could maybe even look at the Mount of Transfiguration. Number 5, both men performed remarkable miracles before eyewitnesses. Both men had power over demonic forces. Both men, interesting enough, had power over bodies of water. You can see Moses parting the Red Sea, Jesus, as I just mentioned a minute ago, calming the Sea of Galilee, walking on the water. Both men's faces shone with the glory of heaven. There you certainly see Moses coming down from Mount Sinai, and his face radiates. And, of course, in the Mount of Transfiguration, of course, Jesus radiates. Number 9, Moses lifted up a brazen serpent to actually heal the people. And Jesus was lifted up on a cross to heal believers from sin. That's a parallel you also find in the book of Hebrews. Interesting enough, on the 17th day of Nisan, which is a month in the Jewish calendar, Moses and Jesus both offered salvation to the people, and that happened 1,500 years apart. Number 11, both men died on a hill, and number 12, their bodies did not remain in a tomb. And so, if nothing else, we see that Jesus is seen as a prophet. And you can think of all sorts of prophetic things that Jesus did. He predicts that the centurion's servant will be healed in Matthew 8. He predicts that Lazarus will be raised from the dead in John 11. He predicts the disciples will find a room prepared for the Passover. He predicts that Judas will betray him. He predicts that his disciples will flee following his arrest. He predicts that Peter will deny him 3 times. We see that in Matthew 26. He predicts his crucifixion. He predicts that he will see his disciples after his resurrection. We see that in Mark 14. He predicts that the Holy Spirit will fill his disciples. We see that in John 14. And he predicts that Jerusalem's temple will be destroyed, and that is in Matthew 24. So if nothing else, you again have some really interesting parallels. And if nothing else, I hope that you recognize that in some ways I'm giving you some kind of new tools to put in your evangelism toolbox, new tools to put into your apologetics toolbox. So even as you talk about Jesus and call people to believe in Jesus, at the same time, you will also find some other ways maybe to get their attention. And so this is one of the reasons why we wanted to cover some of this today here on Point of View. Well, let me take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the resurrection, because certainly that is the capstone and the foundation of everything that we believe in terms of Jesus. We'll talk about the evidence, some of the attempted theories to explain it away. But before we do, let me again mention that one of the things I encourage you to do is go to the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, I hope that you will also click on the button that says donate. And if you can help us out, that would be greatly appreciated. As we come to year end, this is certainly a time in which we wanted to hear from you. At the same time, I know some of you might want to just simply write out a check and make it out to Point of View and send it to Point of View, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. And if you'd like to make a pledge and talk to someone, that is certainly available as well, 1-800-347-5151. Let's take a break, though. We've been talking about the deity of Jesus Christ. It would be remiss if we didn't spend some time, as we will next, talking about the resurrection of Jesus and how important that is to our faith as well. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1987, the Supreme Court was asked whether timbering operations within a national park over a portion of land traditionally used for religious purposes by Native Americans violated the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause. Justice O'Connor's opinion in Ling v. Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association concluded that, quote, whatever rights the Indians may have to the use of the land in question did not divest the government of its right to use what is, after all, its land, unquote. But not all the justices agreed. Justice Brennan, joined by Justices Marshall and Blackmun, disagreed. He reasoned that the timbering in question threatened the, quote, very existence of a Native American religion. He concluded on a somber note, quote, today the court holds that a federal land use decision that promises to destroy an entire religion does not burden the practice of that faith in a manner recognized by the Free Exercise Clause. I find it difficult, however, to imagine conduct more insensitive to religious needs, unquote. 13 years later, Congress would pass the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. At the least, RLUIPA would have required the government to demonstrate that its actions were the least restrictive in pursuit of a compelling government interest. RLUIPA, like RFRA, insists that government actions substantially burdening the free exercise of religion receive heightened scrutiny. That protects all of our religious liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and again, we've been talking about the deity of Jesus Christ, taking some things from this book called Jesus by Tim LaHaye. And Chapter 6 is entitled, Everyone Knows He Rose. So I wanted to spend just a minute talking about the resurrection, because this is, of course, the foundation stone of our biblical faith. So when we talk about the resurrection, let's recognize that the resurrection of Jesus is mentioned more than 100 times in the New Testament. It's sort of the foundation for the Christian faith. As many of us have said before, it's really the only logical explanation for how you have a bunch of depressed, despondent, even fearful disciples who turn out to be a faction of bold, determined leaders who go out and die a martyr's death. As a matter of fact, we have had Sean McDowell on this program, and his most recent academic book actually documents the martyrdom of these various apostles, and is very well done, by the way, and also is included in the More Evidence That Demands a Verdict edition, because there is just so much evidence to suggest that none of them recanted, none of them said, well, wait a minute, and maybe this was a conspiracy that we put together. And yet that, of course, has been the way in modern times people have tried to come up with that, whether it's the Passover plot or the Jesus papers. There have been all sorts of books that have been published to try to explain away the resurrection. Well, let's look at the facts for just a minute. Jesus was whipped, he was beaten, he was crowned with thorns, he was crucified and speared. He was certified as dead by a Roman centurion. We read about that in Mark 15. We have the testimony of blood and water coming out of Jesus' pierced side in John 19, and we know now that that is a good evidence of massive clotting of blood in the arteries, medical proof of death. And so we have this dead individual on the cross. If you've ever seen The Passion of the Christ, you know how brutal the execution of Jesus was. So now you have to come up with some kind of explanation, because then he is taken down from the cross. He is put into the tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea. You have Roman guards sealing the tomb, standing guard, and yet everyone acknowledges the tomb is empty. And then you also have the appearance of Jesus to so many people after the resurrection. Let me just give you a short rundown of those. There are quite a few. Mary Magdalene in Mark 16 and John 20 meets a group of women in Matthew 18 and Luke 24, appears to the apostle Peter, Luke 24, appears to the disciples on the road to Emmaus in Mark 16, appears to 10 disciples in Luke 24 and John 20, then to all 11 disciples later. Remember when Thomas was not there, you have that in John 20. Appears to disciples on the Sea of Galilee in the north in John 21. He appears to more than 500 people in Galilee in Matthew 28. He appears to James in 1 Corinthians 15. He appears to the apostles on the Mount of Olives in Luke 24 and Acts 1. So you have to come up with some kind of explanation for an empty tomb. Well, one of the explanations we have actually in Scripture, and it's in Matthew 28. And that was the theory that was put forward by the Jewish leaders that the disciples stole the body. Now, first of all, does that make any sense? We just pointed out all these disciples were scattered and fearful and all the rest, and now they become bold and proclaim this conspiracy. Not one of them recants. Augustine said, if the guards were awake, why should they suffer the body to be taken away? If asleep, how could they know that the disciples took it? It doesn't work very well. They ran away. They all died a brutal death, with exception of John. Now, some evidence maybe he died or was executed in the Isle of Patmos. We don't know, but nevertheless, they are preaching the gospel, preaching the fact that Jesus rose from the dead in the very city where Jesus was crucified, and it just doesn't make a great deal of sense. Now, at the turn of the last century, there was what was known as the swoon theory. I don't know how people can hold to that if they've even watched the movie, The Passion of the Christ, but the idea was, well, Jesus, he didn't really die. He just swooned on the cross and then later appeared to his disciples of the Lord of life. But again, think about this. He was severely beaten. 4 executioners witnessed his death. He's embalmed in all these spices. How could he roll away a tomb? Some people think it might even be a 2-ton stone in front of the entrance. How could he overpower the guards? How could he walk several miles to Emmaus? It just really is very difficult to come up with an explanation that Jesus swooned on the cross. There are individuals that have researched this that say that we have no evidence of anybody ever surviving crucifixion. Some say, well, the women went to the wrong tomb. Well, then what? The men went to the wrong tomb? The Romans went to the wrong tomb? Joseph of Arimathea didn't know which tomb he was in? That doesn't make a great deal of sense. And some have said, well, maybe they just wanted him to be alive, so they hallucinated this. The problem with that is hallucinations are individual. 500 people saw Jesus. At least in one case, you have a real hardened skeptic, Thomas. He says, until I see his wounds, I'm not going to believe this. And I love the fact that indeed he was not willing to simply capitulate to some of the rumors that people had made. And so I think we see in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul saying that if the dead do not rise, then Christ is not risen. If Christ is not risen, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. But the good news is that he is raised from the dead. Romans 10, verse 9, if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And when you really look at the claims that Jesus makes, you know, either he's an incredible liar, and I find very few people want to land on that one, or maybe you say, well, he's a lunatic, and that is, well, you know, he just was mentally unbalanced, and that certainly does not fit very well. Or otherwise, maybe it's a legend. Oh, you know, maybe some of these documents were written so long after the past that these stories began to develop. You have the Jesus of history, but you have the Christ of faith. Well, we've talked about this in previous programs, how the New Testament documents are written at the time in which the skeptics could disagree. Nobody disagreed with the fact that the tomb was empty. And so if you get rid of all the other L's, Lord, liar, legend, lunatic, you only got one left, right? Lord, because anything else doesn't make a great deal of sense. Well, that's just a quick overview of a lot of material that is in many books on the subject of apologetics. And, of course, I've taken a fair amount of the outline today from this excellent book by Tim LaHaye called Jesus. But, again, you can find material on our website that will certainly be helpful to you. And one of the most important arguments, I think, for the fact that Jesus is alive is how Jesus changes lives. Your testimony is a very good, powerful testimony, and the testimony of literally millions, if not billions of people is perhaps also one of the best evidences for the fact that Jesus is still alive. Let me just, before we wind down this hour, encourage you to visit our website. It is www.pointofview.net. And as you click on the donate button, you can make a special gift just before year end. And we obviously are very dependent upon your financial gifts to bring this program to you, as well as every program. So again, your support would help us end the year in the black. So as you make your gift, again, you might ask for some of the resources we've talked about even today, like Messianic Prophecy booklets and others. And so feel free to check all that out or go to our store and see what's available. But in addition to that, we certainly want to hear from you. So if you can go to the website, pointofview.net, that would be great. If you'd like to talk to someone, maybe make a pledge or put it on your credit card and talk to someone, again, that number is 800-347-5151, 1-800-347-5151. But most importantly, you can also just make a check out to Point of View, make it as generous as you possibly can, and send it to Point of View, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. That's all we have, and so let me again thank you for listening to Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time looking at a variety of different topics. We're going to get our attention for just a few minutes back to Florida, watching what's happening there in Broward County. This article that I've posted here by Kevin Williamson, I just wanted to read parts of it just to get you thinking about what is going to transpire over the next about 48 hours. So we'll get into that briefly. One of the other articles I posted, which is more just one of those roll your eye kind of things, is Dennis Prager, Changing Your Age. You knew this was coming. You just knew this was coming. If indeed sex isn't fixed, as he says in his title, why is age? In other words, if I want to be a girl, even though I'm biologically a boy, if I can do that, why can't I change my age? This has to do with an individual who is 69 years of age, and he wants to alter his birth certificate to show that he's 49. Because after all, when he's on Tinder, and he says 69, nobody clicks on it. But when he says I'm 49, then people have more interest in me. So I just, you keep thinking they're putting you on, and I'm reading this saying, I don't think so. I think they're just that serious. After all, if you can change your gender, why can't you change your age? Some of you women right now are saying, oh, I like that idea. So anyway, that is something I might get to. I might even postpone that a little bit later, but it's one of the articles on our website. In a more serious vein, we're going to talk about a couple of things. CNN has generated a tremendous amount of controversy because, as you well know, the president decided to withdraw the press credentials for CNN's reporter Jim Acosta. So that has led to a variety of different comments. Mark Levin, as you might imagine, has some comments about that, and he's a conservative. But then, interesting enough, Bob Woodward, I think he would feel comfortable calling himself a liberal. He's had some real concerns about that. And so just about the time a lot of people saying, wait a minute, CNN, you just need to back off with this, I now hear that Fox News is backing CNN and actually going to file a brief in that regard. So I'd love to get your thoughts about that. But also, in an even more serious vein, one of the things that I've been following over the last couple of days is what has happened in this case where a good guy with a gun was shot accidentally. An individual, which we'll talk more about in just a few minutes, who was actually doing his best to try to prevent any more shooting. The police show up, assume he is the perpetrator, and kill him. Now, that is a story that we'll get into in some detail because it really works at three different levels that we've talked about on this program before. And I want to do it carefully because I still know I'm going to get emails no matter what I say. On the one hand, it, first of all, reinforces something that one of our callers said the other day, and that is if you're carrying a concealed weapon and you withdraw your weapon and you use that, the police may come in and shoot you. That's exactly what happened there. So that's number one. What can any of us that are concealed carriers actually learn from this, and what should we think about if indeed we try to prevent, I think reasonably try to prevent some kind of action that could save lives. Number two, this also, of course, emphasizes the idea that some police are very willing to pull their weapon out and shoot, sometimes shoot first, ask questions later, which is a conversation we've had with John Whitehead and others about so almost the militaristic idea of some of those in the police force. Not every, and we're not painting with a broad brush, but certainly that's a question to put on the table here. And that's something that David French in our third article talks about. Another police shooting raises hard questions about police restraint. And then if those two issues aren't enough, there's a third issue. The person was shot as African American. Well, you know where that's going to go in terms of the conversation about because he was black, that's why he was shot. And even today, Nick Pitts, who actually is at another gathering, points out that there are some studies that have been done that show that oftentimes when respondents try to envision or describe a drug user, most of them describe that individual as African American. When you talk about an individual who might be a bad guy, sometimes we put an ethnic label to it. So there are a lot of things to cover. If that's not enough, of course, we also have had the controversy, which I mentioned yesterday, between our president and the president of France. And I think Ben Shapiro's done a good job of explaining that nationalism and patriotism don't have to be opposites, which I think would be news to Mr. Macron, Emmanuel Macron, who is the president of France. So we may get to that a little bit later, but I wanted to sort of set the table for you for a few minutes just to know what's going on. So let's work our way, first of all, through what's happening in Florida and what will happen possibly even by tomorrow, but we will see. And that is the whole question that is being raised right now. He says about, I wonder if there is one mentally normal adult walking these fruited plains, even the most craven, abject, brain-dead partisan Democrat who believes that what has been going on in Broward County, Florida is anything other than a brazen attempt to reverse the Republican victories in the state Senate, gubernatorial, and agricultural commissions race. He says, I cannot imagine that there is, but it is really quite something to see partisan Democrats, the same people who believe that the 2016 election was invalid because Boris and Natasha posted something on Facebook, watch not only utterly contented but with joy in their hearts as the rolling crime wave that is Broward County's election supervisor Brenda Snipes and her co-conspirators try to actually steal an election or three. He points about the fact that boxes of ballots magically showing up in the trunks of rental cars in the Fort Lauderdale airport, cars that rented by Democratic operatives. What is this, the Coen brothers movie, he says? At least Saddam Hussein had the good taste to be amusing when he was stuffing the ballot boxes. Saddam Hussein, of course, was the leader in Iraq until he was executed. So anyway, Kevin Williamson goes on to say that voter fraud that our Democrat friends insist never happened happens quite a lot under Snipes' watch. She has allowed disenfranchised felons and illegal aliens to vote. She has sent out mail-in ballots in which a proposed constitutional amendment was simply omitted. She has secretly opened ballots to thwart oversight, and her team doesn't seem to be able to add up votes very quickly, except when they add up them too quickly. In one truly banana public shenanigan, her office posted a final vote tally while the polls were still open. Rick Scott's team has detailed much of this in the legal complaint against her. I will admit that I had heard parts of this, but if indeed everything that Kevin Williamson has said, and I'm sure it was vetted, is true, this is a scandal that definitely needs more attention, maybe than it is even getting right now from the mainstream press. But Kevin Williamson goes on to say, think on that. Let a Republican-run state ask voters for photo identification of the polls, and there's a whole series of wailing and complaints. But when Brenda Snipes openly flouts the law and dares anyone to try to do anything about it, it's the epitome of democracy. I love his answer. Please. So we'll come back and talk about a little bit more of what's going on in Florida and then move on to some other topics. But he really opened my eyes when he began to list all the various things that have been alleged, and many of those have already been confirmed about what is happening there in Broward County. And, of course, you can see that there are going to be some questions about this. I still tend to believe, looking at the vote totals, that even with all the shenanigans, nothing will change in Florida. But I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. It's always possible to steal an election. Look back in Minnesota in 2008. I think that was one of them. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Although America is certainly a divided nation, the divisions between the various tribes are not as great as you might be led to believe. Yes, the social and political debates are loud and intense, but the fringe, rather than the mainstream, gets most of the attention. A study done by the group More in Common discovered the hidden tribes of America. The researchers discovered that a small group of the liberal wing and a smaller group in the conservative wing are the ones who consistently shout, post, and vote, while the rest of America is mostly exhausted by all the rhetoric. Here's an interesting contrast. On the one hand, these two groups hate each other and disagree with each other on just about every topic. On the other hand, they're very much alike. Both groups are mostly white, educated, and politically active. They always vote and give time and money to political campaigns. But here is the relevant fact. The two groups combined only constitute 14% of the American population. In other words, 86% of most of us watch and listen to these two groups argue and criticize each other while ignoring the many points in common we might have. This shouldn't be a surprise to you if you've been listening to my commentaries for any length of time. In the past, I've talked about various points of agreement. For example, Dirk Phillipson made the argument many years ago that you could fill a room with Tea Party members, Occupy Wall Street activists, and concerned Americans and find agreement. He says you would find people concerned about concentrated power, out-of-control change, and concerns about a government that no longer represents the people. After this divisive election season, we need to find a way to bring the American people together. We won't bring people together if we let the two fringe wings of the political spectrum dominate all of our discussions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
A few more minutes as we talk about Florida, and then we want to talk about the police shooting of a good guy with a gun, a security officer, 26 years of age, who found himself shot simply because he had done the right thing. He was a security guard. He actually was able to bring the assailant down, had him subdued, had a knee in his back, a gun in his back. The police arrive and shoot him, and he dies in the hospital. Now, African-American, the race issue is certainly one of those, and also the concern that any police officer would have about the fact he's about ready to shoot this person. Yes, but he's the security guard. Wise if he had a uniform, but, coulda, shoulda, woulda. We could have come up with all sorts of things, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Well, let me focus for just a minute on this recount in Florida and all the concerns about it. This piece by Kevin Williamson is really good because in about 3 pages summarizes not only what is happening in Florida, but puts it in context, which is what I'd like to do right now. We've talked about this woman, Brenda Snipes. I don't even know how she keeps getting elected, although I think I do know how she keeps getting elected, but she's in that position. But then he goes on to say that people turn to conspiracy theories for all sorts of reasons, but one of those reasons is that corrupt Democrat officials in state and federal governments, this is not an equally bipartisan problem, have by their criminal actions rendered those kinds of suspicions more plausible. Nobody, he says, really thinks that Lois Lerner and her Democratic colleagues at the Internal Revenue Service were just trying to do their duty when they illegally targeted and harassed Tea Party groups and other critics of the Obama administration. Nobody really believes that Hillary Clinton is just somebody who doesn't know how email works. No rational adult believes that Kathleen Sebelius, the HHS secretary, EPA boss Lisa Jackson, and some of the others were using secret email accounts set up under fake names to avoid getting spam in their inboxes. It is difficult to believe that it was pure coincidence that John Kerry's stepson went into the foreign investment business with Joe Biden's son at just the moment their fathers were in the position to shape U.S. foreign policy. It's one thing to be angry partisan. It's another to abandon all self-respect and pretend not to see what you see. And he says, and that's just at the federal level. He says, who can defend the attempts to prosecute Rick Perry or some other individuals, or the individuals who are related to, and he goes into Tom DeLay and Kay Bailey, and I'll pass on some of that, Kay Bailey Hutchinson and others, but talks about all sorts of things happening at the statewide level. And so finally he says, whatever bedtime stories Democrats tell themselves so that they can sleep at night, this stuff is obvious corruption. Philadelphia has a long history of voter shenanigans, from elections that had to be overturned because of rampant voter fraud, as well as, in this particular case, I love this because the Philadelphia Inquirer, so don't take my word for it, this as a quote from the Philadelphia Inquirer, quote, we found ballots cast on behalf of dead people, fictitious people, and real people living in such places as Las Vegas, Greenland, and Crete. And we also found ballots cast from vacant lots and abandoned buildings. By the way, he's just picking on Philadelphia there because he happens to know the story. We have talked about that also in some of the things that have happened in places like Houston, Texas, and all the rest. So he says the bigger problem is this. Even if Brenda Snipes were simply an incompetent individual with no business overseeing anything more complicated than the assembly of a Lego project, he says the history of obvious and undeniable corruption in electoral and related matters makes malfeasance a perfectly reasonable supposition. In other words, what he's saying is, for all the people saying, you guys are coming up with these wild conspiracy theories, well, the thing that feeds that is all the other history, and I've only given you part of the history of what actually justifies starting to have some real doubts about how honest that is taking place. And so his conclusion is this: whether it's petty corruption or non-petty corruption, they both undermine faith in our public institutions and democratic processes. The less people trust in those institutions, the less effective those institutions are. People either become less inclined to participate in those corrupt processes, or seeing the corruption and assuming that it represents the normal and expected state of play, come to accept or even encourage similar corruption on their own side. One suspects that the Democrats spend so much time wailing about disenfranchisement, which is how they describe the enforcement of ordinary voting laws and standards of credibility, for precisely that reason. If you tell yourself that you are just trying to level the playing field, then you can justify all sorts of corruption. And so the point he's making is that what we're seeing in Florida is not a one-off, as we oftentimes hear people say. There is a reason that people tend to wonder whether or not everything is on the up and up in Florida, simply on the basis of what has been happening in the past. So if you want to join us, I certainly want to hear from some of you in Florida. Maybe you've got some more insight into that. But before we go any further, I wanted to get to this one story, which I've been following for a couple of days. I first heard about this when, I think it was David French, posted something on a Twitter feed, and then yesterday wrote a very good piece, which we have posted on our website, Shooting a Good Guy with a Gun. The actual title is, Another Police Shooting Raises Hard Questions About Police Restraint. He said, first of all, David French says, if I'd ever had to use a gun to defend myself or others, I've often wondered, what would I do when the police arrived? After all, they're not going to be able to immediately discern friend from foe. Each person with a drawn weapon will be perceived as a threat, and the chances of mistaken identity are high. That's one of the things we had a comment from one of our listeners the other day, and love to hear some of your comments about that. So now he tells us the story. He said, on an early Sunday morning in Illinois, mistaken identity cost an armed citizen his life. The facts are terrible. Simply put, a police officer shot and killed a good guy with a gun. He shot Jameel Robertson, a young black security guard who used his weapon to stop an attempted murder and to secure the suspect. According to the local media reports, after security asked intoxicated customers to leave Manny's Blue Room bar, a person approached the bar with a gun and opened fire. Security returned fire, and Robertson reportedly detained a suspect and held him on the ground with Robertson's knee and gun in the suspect's back. What happened next is tragic because the report says soon after, witnesses said an officer responding to the scene fired at Robertson, killing him. Everybody was screaming out, "Security! He was a security guard!" And they still did their job, saw a black man with a gun, and basically killed him. Now, that, of course, comes from the eyewitnesses. So NPR reported that Robertson was wearing his uniform, including a hat that labeled it security. So again, to say, I didn't know he was a security guard, it's a little tougher to deal with. Making matters worse, there is a report that other officers were already outside with Robertson handling the situation appropriately when a cop ran actually inside the bar and opened fire. So it could have been something that was on the responsibility of just one individual who was overreacting. Nevertheless, the sad story is Robertson wanted to be a police officer. He had a 9-month-old son, played music for area churches, and he says, our hearts ache at his death. So David French says this, I want to first state the obvious. It is hard for a police officer to arrive on a dangerous crime scene and immediately possess the necessary situational awareness. It is especially difficult if there's an extraordinarily heightened alert because shots have already been fired. And we know such situations are extremely dangerous for cops. A police officer was gunned down just last week responding to the Thousand Oaks, California mass shooting. In other words, he says, this wasn't like some previous police shootings of innocent armed citizens that hadn't gone to the wrong house. They hadn't mishandled a routine traffic stop. They hadn't entered a man's home without a warrant. Police were arriving at the scene of a firefight. At the same time, however, armed citizens stop enough shootings for police to understand from the moment they get the call that a private citizen may have already responded and may be defending the lives of innocent men and women in those precious minutes before the police arrive. Therefore, from the moment a police officer arrives, he cannot assume that everyone who is armed is hostile. This places an undeniable burden on the cop to make rapid, accurate assessments of the situation from the moment they arrive, including listening to the bystanders. There's also the burden on the armed citizen to clearly identify himself immediately, but his or her burden is lesser. They may be engaged in a life and death struggle and must focus on the immediate threat. So when we come back from the break, I want to spend a little more time kind of working our way through the various situations. What, in this case, a security guard, which apparently now we understand had a uniform, what is our responsibility if our concealed carry and I'm not in a uniform? What's the responsibility of the police? And how much was simply a result of the fact that he, that is the police officer, comes in, sees an African-American man with a gun pointed at somebody on the floor and decides it is time to kill him, who was actually the good guy with the gun. You got some comments about this? I would love to hear them. 1-800-351-1212. We're going to sort through some more of the issues related to this particular incident and see if we can learn some lessons. All that coming up right after this.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. pointofview.net/team. pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
So there's this guy named Jordan. He's a healthy guy. He's a dad of 6, and he works as a guide in Alaska. And he goes to the doctor, true story, he goes to the doctor, and he's diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. And here's the thing. He had switched earlier from medical insurance to Medishare, where Christians share each other's medical bills. So the question for Jordan and his wife Jenny was, is this actually going to work?
Our medical bills exceeded $160,000. Medishare members shared all our bills.
And it was about more than just the money, too. This is a real community.
Medishare is a family, a group of people that stick with you through the hardest times of your life. I just don't know how I could have done it without Medishare.
It's so worth looking into. There's a reason this is growing so fast. So if you want to find out more, here is a number for you. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to those calls in just a minute. You might say, well, why talk about this one incident in Illinois? Well, first of all, again, anytime there's a shooting like this, and especially where it is a shooting of a good guy with a gun, I want to come back to that issue in just a minute, because some people say, well, that's why we shouldn't have individuals having guns. Nobody should have a concealed carry. Maybe even security guards shouldn't have one. Well, I think we have a pretty good answer to that. You just think how worse this situation would have been if Robertson had not been present when somebody opens fire in a bar. So the first question you have to begin to ask is, how does this affect anybody in the listening audience that has a weapon, whether it's a law enforcement officer, somebody has concealed carry? All of us, probably most of us, I could say all of us, but most of us probably go to a church. Some churches have security guards, some do not. Some have armed police, some do not. But that's a whole question about this as well. And then, of course, if indeed there has been some mistake made by police officers, we all pay the taxes to those individuals. So this particular story brings that together, in addition to one other topic, of course, we've addressed many times, because it was an African-American security officer with his knee in the back of an assailant with a gun pointed at him, and he's the one that got killed by a police officer rushes in. So let me finish this off and start taking some phone calls, because David French says, we still have some sketchy details about the news reports. And he says, I have all sorts of questions. Did the officer clearly identify himself and shout clear commands? How chaotic was the scene at the moment of the shooting? Were bystanders warning that the armed man was a security guard clear enough to be heard? Was there enough light to see that security guard's uniform? Was he given an opportunity to say or do anything before the officer opened fire? Okay, a lot of questions there. But he said, for those who read this terrible story and immediately attack the entire concept of a good guy with a gun, he says, imagine if Robertson had not been present. How many people would the gunman have killed? Here, the good guy with a gun did his job. It's the police that failed. There's no reason to limit or scorn Second Amendment rights. Indeed, the armed citizen appeared to have the situation under control until police arrived. David French, on the other hand, says, we ask a lot of cops. We truly do. In some ways, we ask more of them than we should. They are all too often the state's immediate point of contact with mentally distressed individuals. It is not asking too much to ask them to shoot the right person or not shoot at all. But he says there's no easy fix here. There's no simple training tip that can remove the fog and fear of a firefight. And that urgency is absolutely enhanced when a police officer sees a gun pointed at another person. At the same time, a citizen's right of self-defense shouldn't face material limits simply because police officers may make mistakes. So-called common-sense gun control doesn't have much bearing on cases like this. But as we ponder these situations, I come back again and again to two words: awareness and restraint. Police must be aware of the possible presence of a good guy with a gun. They must continue to train themselves in the unique skill of assessing a tactical situation under duress. Armed citizens, to the extent that they are able, must also be aware that the police will approach and will not immediately know who is a threat. Then there's restraint. What is the additional risk of pausing just a bit to take in more information? There is a risk either way. Pause a moment, a bad guy gains an advantage, shoot immediately, you may shoot the wrong man. So again, he says, soon enough we get the complete facts of this terrible night in Illinois. We'll learn that the police officer plainly and clearly acted with reckless haste, or we may learn complicated facts. One fact is unlikely to change. Jameel Robertson died a hero. May he rest in peace. So we posted that article so you can read it. I think it, again, helps us understand that there are multiple factors here simultaneously to consider. And so I want to hear from some of you. Some of you in law enforcement can educate us about this. I want to share a story in just a minute about how there was a near shooting in a bar near Dallas because of almost mistaken identity, but in this case, restraint was enough to save a life. So sometimes we can make the right decision and nobody hears about it, In this case, somebody may have made the wrong decision, and of course, we're talking about it right now. Let's take some phone calls. We'll head out to California first. Jeff, you have the first comment on Point of View. What would you like to share?
Yes, I don't know the whole facts like you were saying just a moment ago, but I think there was a loss of communication with dispatch when that officer arrived at the scene. That's what it sounds like. Like I said, I don't know the facts. And me and my daughter were talking about scenarios about should schools have weapons in their teachers be armed with weapons in their school. And she said something about that scenario. What if it was a black teacher that had a firearm and cops respond? Well, first of all, I told her, once the threat is eliminated already, that teacher should have placed the gun down. So
yeah.
Even if
holster it, put it on the floor, whatever, if indeed you've minimized or eliminated the threat. Now, sometimes in this case, the threat wasn't eliminated. He's got a knee in the back of the individual, but that's one of the arguments that I hear all the time. I don't want to arm teachers or even security guards here because if the police come in, SWAT comes in, they don't know good guys from bad guys, And in this case, we apparently had an individual in uniform. How visible that was, of course, we'll find out maybe as time goes on, but it's a very important question to put on the table, don't you think?
Yes, sir. It absolutely is. And with all the division that's going on with all these shooting scenarios all over the country, yes, we need to find a solution for it.
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up. And dispatch was one thing that came to mind here because if indeed it was calling in, there's been a shooting at the bar, that's one thing. If there's been a shooting at the bar, but it looks like the security guard has minimized it. We just need the police to show up, but he's on the floor or something like that. Might have been different, but who knows how that was reported, how that was passed on to the next officers. And when, as he said, when shots have been fired, it's a whole different scenario. And I understand that. So let's go to Georgia. Mike, I understand that you have been in the FBI and SWAT, and I think we just need to sit back and listen to your commentary. So thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, appreciate it. And it was all good comments. And I just wanted to add, because I just went through some alert training. Alert training is how do you respond to a mass shooting or a shooting in a school or a mall, or, you show up. And it's different when I'm with my SWAT buddies and we all know what each other are going to do, how we're going to act. But when you show up and maybe you're dropping your son off at school or daughter off at school and you hear shots, maybe it's just you. What are you going to do? You got 2 or 3 guys. So we put on these trainings and we also partake in these trainings. And one thing I'll say about citizens, yeah, I'm all for everyone. I think you're responsible. You go out and you train with your gun, carry it. Now, there's things you can do. There's sashes they make that mount on your belt. If you're an off-duty cop, let's say, or you're a security guard and you're carrying your gun, but you're not wearing your uniform, you can wear this sash, and basically it has a little handle, and you pull it over your shoulder. It's like if you're in a pageant, and it says police on it. It's a very small little pouch that you can do that. We don't all wear that. I don't do that. I dress down all the time, and I got a gun. I've got spare mag. I got some things. I have a badge on my belt. But let's say I'm at the school. Do I have my badge that day? If I do, it's on my belt. It's covered up by my shirt. I don't have a uniform. So what do you do? So the easiest answer is, like you said, you don't have the sash, the badge. You don't have a chance to put it around your neck if you got a badge. So when you turn, that guy's going to see, where's he looking? He's looking at your center or your chest, because that's probably where he's going to shoot if he's trained. So if you got your badge there, that's great, but citizens don't have badges.
Right.
But the other thing you do is, the time if you to do it and you do take that life or shoot that person, put your gun down, put it away.
I agree.
That first responders are coming in, and they're trained, but they don't have a couple seconds. You turn and that gun's pointed towards them.
Oh boy, that's
They're
it.
not going to have much choice but to shoot.
That's right.
So just put your gun down, put it away, holster it, put your hands up, do what the police say. Cops are not going to, they may have enough time to sit at the door, and if I'm responding, I may have enough time to interview someone and say, hey, what's the guy look like? Probably not. You got shooting, you hear shooting going on, you're going in.
Once shots are fired, you don't have a chance to say, well, let's just talk to the bystanders out here for a few minutes before I go in. Yeah, not happening.
And action, you're always taught, and people don't understand why cops are shooting like that, but action beats reaction all the time.
Yes, it does.
But you don't have a chance to just, guy turns a gun on you to say, hey, I'm the police, drop your weapon by that time you're shot.
That's all right. That's
so
right.
Don't do that. If you're in there and you notice there's one shooter and that shooter's now down, put your gun down. Put your gun away, throw it on the floor, put your hands up. And that's the easiest answer. Is no good answer, but that's what you got to do. But appreciate that. I love the conversation you're having. It's needed. But it's unfortunate what happened out there to that guy. He may have come in doing the right thing, took that extra second, and got shot by a guy he thought was a good guy.
Yeah. Mike, I appreciate that. We are safer because of people like you. We'll be back with more calls right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1987, the Supreme Court was asked whether timbering operations within a national park over a portion of land traditionally used for religious purposes by Native Americans violated the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause. Justice O'Connor's opinion in Ling v. Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association concluded that, quote, whatever rights the Indians may have to the use of the land in question did not divest the government of its right to use what is, after all, its land, unquote. But not all the justices agreed. Justice Brennan, joined by Justices Marshall and Blackmun, disagreed. He reasoned that the timbering in question threatened the, quote, very existence of a Native American religion. He concluded on a somber note, quote, today the court holds that a federal land use decision that promises to destroy an entire religion does not burden the practice of that faith in a manner recognized by the Free Exercise Clause. I find it difficult, however, to imagine conduct more insensitive to religious needs, unquote. 13 years later, Congress would pass the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. At the least, RLUIPA would have required the government to demonstrate that its actions were the least restrictive in pursuit of a compelling government interest. RLUIPA, like RFRA, insists that government actions substantially burdening the free exercise of religion receive heightened scrutiny. That protects all of our religious liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Obviously, what happened to Jamel Robertson went terribly wrong. Let me tell real quickly a story of something that went right, and this comes from years ago. I do a taped program, a probe radio program. It's 3 minutes long, and my engineer back in the 1980s, when he was doing a ride-along with a police officer, just said, you know, have you ever had an opportunity where you shot someone or almost shot someone? And he told the story. And I'm going to simplify it tremendously, but it relates very much to just what happened to this bar there outside of Chicago. That was Manny's Blue Bar in Robbins, but here was one in the Dallas area. And there had been a report of a burglary no, I guess it was an armed robbery, excuse me, of a bar, and the police officer that was telling the story, all of a sudden has his weapon in his hand, and around the corner comes a guy running, and the guy behind him running has a gun in his hand. And so he raises his service, in this case revolver, and says, "Halt, drop your weapon." And as the man starts to turn, he pulls the trigger slightly, and he could see the cylinder begin to move. The man drops his weapon and holds up his hands. Turns out the man with the gun was the bar owner chasing the individual who actually had engaged in the armed robbery. Now, that was, one trigger pull away from killing or at least wounding the bar owner. But guess what? The police officer shows up on the scene. The facts at hand, one guy's running, one guy's got a gun in his hand. What are you going to do? And in this particular case, he did the right thing, and he avoided a loss of life. But it, I think, is a good way to illustrate what police officers, when they come on a scene, have to encounter, and how a tremendous amount of situational awareness have to figure out what's going on very, very quickly. And so it's a lesson to be learned for anybody that might indeed be willing to have a concealed carry permit. And so let's go to someone who wants to talk about that in Ohio. Brian, thank you for joining our conversation today. What's your point of view?
Hey, I just wanted to, I'm a 30-year veteran. I have had some experience when I was deployed to Kosovo. The split-second decision is exactly what it is. Now, I am a concealed carry weapons holder, along with my daughter and wife, too. And one of the things I've always told them is that, you have to, when you make a call to police, and this actually did happen to me a few years back, thought there was someone in our house, and I told my wife to call the police and let them know what I was wearing, what I was doing. And so that communication is a very important factor when going into these situations.
Certainly is. Again, if you're carrying a weapon, first of all, you've got to understand, the situations and whether or not you need to use lethal force. There are other ways to use verbal jujitsu. There are all sorts of things you can spray, mace, and a number of other things before you take a life. But if you ever do, and those shots are ringing out and you're exchanging gunfire, when the police show up, they've already heard gunfire. So it's really very, very quick that something can go bad very quickly if you are holding a gun. I don't care if you're white or black, a male or female, you have a gun in your hand that is a lethal weapon that if it turns towards that police officer, that officer really doesn't have much choice but to probably shoot you. And so just to think about where that weapon is pointed, whether you even keep it in your hand, whether you holster it, there's a lot of questions you need to ask and answer very, very quickly.
Absolutely. And my point is that responsibility goes both ways. And because, like you said, you are holding a weapon that will kill. And like I said, I've been in those situations in the military as an entry team, going after some war criminals and some wanted people in that time frame. And those split seconds are definitely, split seconds.
Sure is. Well, again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Wanda in Georgia. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. My main thing is everybody's saying the security guard should have put his gun down or whatever.
I don't think so. Yeah. Go ahead.
That had him under control. But if he put his gun down, would he still have him under control?
No. I think that's how he had him. I don't blame the security guard. Of course, we don't know all the details. Maybe there was something else that was there, but I think it's almost... It's not the same as some of these other shootings in that sense, but we may find out, as we seem to now hear, there's one report that there were officers already outside and then this individual rushes in. So we don't know all the details, but let me come back to that. I mean, the way he's able to keep that individual down with his knee in the back is because he also has a weapon pointed at him, and that's what security guards are supposed to do. So,
Right.
you know, I'm not saying that, but I am saying that if you are concealed carry, if you have minimized the threat or eliminated the threat, then I think putting the gun on the ground, putting it in a holster, back in your purse, wherever it is, eliminates any possible confusion as a police officer walks in the door.
Well, I agree. I wouldn't be a cop for all teen time, but I think a lot of them get raw deals, and I'm sure they're walking on nerves constantly now with all that's going on. But you can't always just, put your weapon down because the cops are coming, because that guy that did the shooting might either pick it up or he's going to fight you. You don't have a gun on me now, I will physically attack you.
I'm with you. Yeah, and even if you have a weapon pointed at them, they don't always stop. You know, it looks real good on television. It doesn't happen that way. They, you point a gun at them, and they just come at you anyway, daring you to shoot them. And if they're strung out on some kind of drug, they're not necessarily going to stop even after you've pumped some things into them. So I'm with you on that. Let's. One of the other issues we've put on the table here is the racial component, and I think Calvin in Georgia wants to address that. So, Calvin, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. I don't want to use so much the racial thing, even though it's there. But how much training, as I heard the gentleman 2 calls earlier say that everybody needs to go back and train. How much training do you need? I mean, from all these killings that's been going on recently, right? As an officer, you should have some type of mindset going into to be a little bit alert, but to just go in and do the Tamar Rice thing. Dispatch clearly said that this kid looks like a toy gun. Jumps out, shoots the kid.
Yep, that's right.
But my point with being a security guard, because my son and my son-in-laws, they are officers also, and security officers. So my son said, "I got to do this," but now the racial thing plays in effect.
Sure does.
Also, because I mean, my son is 6'4".
Ooh.
And he's a husky dude. So
I'm glad he's on our side. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I am not minimizing that at all. The fact that he was an African American security guard, and especially if he had not had a uniform, and the point you're making is one that also is relevant. I think all three of these issues, the responsibility of somebody with a gun, in this case, of course, it was a security guard, but for some people, maybe concealed carry, the responsibility of the police, and then the racial component, because when I see an individual, African American with a gun, is that more likely that somebody's going to pull the trigger? We'll know more later, but I just think this is a conversation we need to have so we can learn some lessons. So let's take a break. I will certainly take some more phone calls right after these important messages.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team. Pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
So there's this guy named Jordan. He's a healthy guy. He's a dad of 6, and he works as a guide in Alaska. And he goes to the doctor, true story, he goes to the doctor, and he's diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. And here's the thing. He had switched earlier from medical insurance to Medishare, where Christians share each other's medical bills. So the question for Jordan and his wife, Jenny, was, is this actually going to work?
Our medical bills exceeded $160,000. Medishare members shared all our bills.
And it was about more than just the money, too. This is a real community.
Medishare is a family, a group of people that stick with you through the hardest times of your life. I just don't know how I could have done it without Medishare.
It's so worth looking into. There's a reason this is growing so fast. So if you want to find out more, here is a number for you. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Next hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. At the moment, talking about an incident that took place over the weekend in a bar just outside of Chicago. And it, again, is a shooting of Jamil Robertson, 26-year-old security guard who actually was able to subdue one of the individuals involved in a shooting in Manny's Blue Bar in Robbins. Apparently had his security uniform on, had subdued one of the individuals, had his knee in his back, but a gun pointed in his back when officers got there. There is some question as to whether or not the story that's been told right now of the officers already had recognized that he was a security officer, and then another person runs in and shoots him. But it, of course, raises all sorts of questions. Number one, if you are an individual with a weapon, a law enforcement officer, a security guard, or just have concealed carry, what is your responsibility when the police arrive, and what kind of mistakes could you make that could cause you to be killed? That's one issue. Number two, what kind of situational awareness and kind of training should police officers have, recognizing that when they come on a scene, there may be not only bad guys with a gun, but there could be a good guy with a gun. In this case, a good guy with a gun was killed. And then number three, because Jamil is African-American, well, you know the rest of that story. What kind of racial component related to that as well? And so we'll stay on this for a while as the calls go. A little bit later, I do want to, if we have time, talk about CNN. If not, we'll get to that tomorrow. There's always tomorrow. But again, it's been kind of intriguing to see that CNN filing a lawsuit against the White House simply because of their decision to pull Jim Acosta's press credentials. This is not a violation, by the way, of the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment or Fifth Amendment or anything else. I mean, this is just simply a choice that could be made. Maybe it's a bad choice, but that's the case. And so you have some comments by everybody from Bob Woodward, who might be easily called a liberal, Mark Levin, who obviously we could call a conservative. And in the midst of this, now Fox News has decided that they're going to actually support CNN's lawsuit against the Trump administration. So go figure. I mean, I can't even put all that together. But I see many of you would like to address this issue, and at every level there are some questions about the responsibility of us, if you have a weapon, the responsibility of law enforcement when they come on a scene, and, of course, the racial issue as well, because in this case, Jamil Robertson is a 26-year-old was a 26-year-old African-American. Just a sad story, but at the same time, maybe we can learn some lessons that we can apply to our lives. So let's, if we can, go back to the phones. Daryl in Texas, I'd love to hear your comments.
Yes, sir. Hello?
Hello, you're on the air.
Oh, good. Glad to be here. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
My thought was, as an African-American male in America, I don't want anyone to think that African-American males against the police. I'd like for you guys to know that we just live in two different worlds. And my opinion is that when I was young growing up, the police was not our friend.
Yep.
You know, I know we have come a long ways in this country.
Yeah, you would not call them. You know, if they showed up, you were not necessarily feeling a sense of relief, right?
No, we try to. I mean, in the African American community, we try to handle things on our own because of the fact that if the police came, we don't know where he's staying with us.
Makes sense. And again, I appreciate you because again, we live in different worlds. I don't know enough about the police officer that pulled the trigger. We will find out that in time. But again, that's one of those questions that a lot of people have had, and that is live in different worlds. Good point. Some of you want to talk about police training. So let me stay in the state of Texas for just a minute. Robert, I think you have some comments about that. So you're on the air.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate your show and listen every day.
Thank you.
My comment is this. I speak from experience. I have friends that are in law enforcement and some close interfamily that are in law enforcement, local or close by big cities I won't name. But, you know, where people aren't, society is not questioning the right questions or placing the right questions is training in the municipalities. These officers go and they get trained and are put through extensive shooting range time, so many bullets they got to fire, so many groupings they got to maintain. The emphasis is all based on their ability to shoot a target. and predominantly that's the training, is for them to lethally protect themselves, I guess. But why not, like European countries, we start really looking at the officers we're hiring, the training they're getting, the background, the mental state, the prescriptions that they may be using, as well as, let's be honest, what about steroids? We know that alters the mental state. There's a lot of that's unspoken. But the training, we only train them to shoot. And, you know, I'm not against the police. Plenty that are friends. I love them. We need them. Society's got to have them. But the training is for them to shoot. Where is the training for them not to shoot? These guys are professionals. They should be at the highest level of professionalism in preserving life, not taking it or incarcerating it just based on a split second. Sure, they have a right to protect themselves. Everyone does. But to shoot first is what we see in the media, which is, you know, partially manipulated or mostly manipulated, but that's what we get. We get to see, bam, why did the guy get shot? Well, we want to know what the guy did wrong. Why not we ask, you know, what about the training? Was the officer, did he have any of these in his record prior? You know, that's where we're, as society, we're not asking these questions.
Well, and again, I hope some of that comes out. And again, we may not stay on this story much longer, other than I just think it was, again, bringing together a lot of different issues. And, of course, your question about training to shoot, but training when not to, I mean, that's an important part of that as well. And I think it gets to the next caller who wants to address that issue. So let's go out to Georgia in this case. Carl, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you for having me. I have the same feelings that a police officer, you know, sometimes has a tendency to perhaps shoot. You know, they're wearing the cameras nowadays and everything, and I don't believe a police officer should ever shoot somebody if they're not pointing a gun at them. And in many cases that we see on television, the officer shoots the guy, and he's not, you know, either his back's turned to the police officer, or he has a knife perhaps in his hand that's 3 inches long, you know, that type of thing. And at least maybe with the cameras we'll get some information from them. But it should never, ever have an officer shoot somebody unless they're positive that's, you know, that's the right person.
And again, I don't know enough. I'll leave it to some of our listeners that want to call in. The lethal force is obviously justified if the gun is pointed at you, but also in this case, it was pointed at someone else. Now, in this case, I still think the officer might have made a mistake, probably did. But if I see somebody going to kill someone else, am I justified in using lethal force? That's a tougher judgment call, but I think that would be the case. But let's give some of our experts a chance to call in and help us out. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Although America is certainly a divided nation, the divisions between the various tribes are not as great as you might be led to believe. Yes, the social and political debates are loud and intense, but the fringe, rather than the mainstream, gets most of the attention. A study done by the group More in Common discovered the hidden tribes of America. The researchers discovered that a small group of the liberal wing and a smaller group in the conservative wing are the ones who consistently shout, post, and vote, while the rest of America is mostly exhausted by all the rhetoric. Here's an interesting contrast. On the one hand, these two groups hate each other and disagree with each other on just about every topic. On the other hand, they're very much alike. Both groups are mostly white, educated, and politically active. They always vote and give time and money to political campaigns. But here is the relevant fact. The two groups combined only constitute 14% of the American population. In other words, 86% of most of us watch and listen to these two groups argue and criticize each other while ignoring the many points in common we might have. This shouldn't be a surprise to you if you've been listening to my commentaries for any length of time. In the past, I've talked about various points of agreement. For example, Dirk Phillipson made the argument many years ago that you could fill a room with Tea Party members, Occupy Wall Street activists, and concerned Americans and find agreement. He says you would find people concerned about concentrated power, out-of-control change, and concerns about a government that no longer represents the people. After this divisive election season, we need to find a way to bring the American people together. We won't bring people together if we let the two fringe wings of the political spectrum dominate all of our discussions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's talk a little bit longer about this particular shooting there in Illinois. We'll move on to some other topics, and you will find those also on the website. Third one, which we're talking about at the moment, shooting a good guy with a gun, and then we'll come back to a couple of other topics that are relevant, especially when I get into this issue of the CNN lawsuit. It, again, is another opportunity to maybe educate all of us about what the First Amendment and the Fifth Amendment really mean, what the Congress can do, what the president can do, what the Constitution permits and not permits. So a lot of that we'll cover in just a few minutes. But let's, if we can, go back to the phones, and we'll talk to Milton in Texas. Milton, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me, and good afternoon. With regards to the shooting in Illinois, it's a very complex matter, and the first thing that came to my mind was a question, because it hasn't, or at least I haven't seen it, the racial makeup of both the perpetrator and the police officer. Of course, it was well reported that of the victim. And so the first thing I thought about was, well, you know, how relevant was that to the story in reality? It's a tragedy. No one would want to see that happen. And, you know, what if that security guard was white? Would we even be talking about this story? That was my first thought. And the second thing is, in terms of training and community policing and whether or not those officers really had a sense for that neighborhood, such that even with a heightened sense of awareness, there was also the same level of caution in approaching that situation. And I think Without that, you will always have the potential for tragedy as occurred in this case.
Well, first of all, to your first point, I would want to certainly talk about it, because whether it was a security guard, African American, Hispanic American, Anglo American, whatever, it raises the question that we've talked about before and even talked about earlier in the week, and that is when individuals concealed carry and you come on a scene and you've got a gun in your hand, what's the possibility? And one of our callers the other day was mentioning, well, the police might shoot you because they think you're the perpetrator. So in some respects, you're right. I'm not sure that the racial component there is, as important necessarily as the bigger issue of here is a good example of a good guy with a gun that gets shot. But it's a good point. But again, back to the whole issue of training. I'll let you finish. Go ahead.
No. So with respect to training, I think that does bleed over into what you may have heard about in a lot of cities where there's this necessity for community policing, so that now you don't have this wall, perceived or real in some cases, that the police are the enemy and not our friends. The police should be our friends, but you can't have friends without some form of relationship, and you don't have that unless you have a sense of community. So I really want to close on that note.
Good point. And I think it reinforces some of the things we just heard earlier from some of our other callers. And, we've had some people off air ask, well, do we know if the police officer was white or black? We don't know because that individual is unnamed. I'm sure we'll find out. Or maybe there's some new stories that have come out that give us that. I think we could probably guess, but, I think Milton makes a good point. We talked about the ethnic background of the person, the security guard that was killed, but didn't talk about the other one. Let's, if I can, learn from some of you that actually are involved in law enforcement at one level or another. So I want to go to South Carolina and talk to Robert. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
What I wanted to tell you, I worked in the Air Force for 23 years as a police officer. I got out and went to the Department of Corrections. I was there for 13 years. I went to the Department of Corrections because I didn't want to keep carrying a weapon. But I ended up in the Department of Corrections over a contraband section. And the inmates decided I was doing too good a job. Uh-oh. And they paid a gang member, the Crips. They paid one of their members who had just got out to come to my house. And he shot me 6 times in the stomach and abdomen area. If you hear the way I'm talking, that's because one of my lungs is like operating on 1%. This happened in 2010.
Wow. It's
still on the internet. And what I'm saying, I didn't have a weapon then. I carry one now. But I made a determination, I'm African American, that if an officer pulls me over, I will not tell him I have a weapon until if he decides he's going to frisk me or something, or search me, I would tell him then. If I'm out and on incidents, something happened to someone and told my wife, never say I have a weapon, I would determine when I will pull it. And there are some instances where I will not pull it because I don't want to get shot again. Shouldn't be that way, but I will make sure anytime an officer comes around, my weapon will be in the holster. And my holster is made where you can't tell it's a gun unless I tell you.
Well, again, that's the fear that you have of someone overreacting, and I think that's a legitimate concern. Of course, first of all, I'm just sorry for what happened to you. I mean, when you are doing the right thing and actually supporting law enforcement as a corrections officer, and then they hire somebody in a hit, just amazing.
$6,000.
Yeah.
$6,000 is what they put on life. Told my wife I thought I was at least worth $10,000.
Yes.
They paid $6,000 to this guy to kill me.
That's incredible. Well,
it is.
Robert, let me first of all encourage our listeners to be praying for you. I mean, obviously, when you have a 1% lung capacity, I mean, I just can imagine what your life must be like. And you didn't deserve any of that. And, of course, neither did Jamil Robertson. But
No. Well, let me say this, and I'm going to get off the phone.
Okay.
I've learned what the Lord allows, he makes provisions for. He's made provisions, and I've been able to go all over America telling my story to Congress and everything about cell phones in prisons. And that's how this came about, because cell phones. So that the Lord has made a way for me to speak before a lot of powerful people. So I don't take it as something waste. I'm using it as for what I can to help make people aware of the problem. But I tell, like I tell my sons, I don't know why. I don't know if the officers are afraid of black men or what, but just be cautious because they'll live to tell the story.
I would certainly agree. Robert, appreciate you sharing your story. I mean, it's kind of hard to even say anything because I just realized what you've been through, and it's just really sad to hear it. And I would certainly encourage our listeners to pray for Robert in South Carolina.
Thank you.
So thank you for sharing that with us today.
Thank you.
Oh, that brings some reality to it, doesn't it? Well, we've still got one more phone call before we get bottom of the hour, and then we may move on to another topic. And so we'll go to Missouri. Scott, what's on your mind?
Hey, Kerby, thanks for taking the call. I think we need to be I think we need to be reminded of where we're talking about. We're talking about the Chicago area, which you have two things going on there. One, you do have a history of police abuse. There's no doubt about that. I mean, that goes all the way back to the Prohibition era. The second thing you have there is just the tremendous mass killing of African Americans, and so I think there's no question in my mind race was a factor in this, but I also think it has to be taken in context of where it's at. Was it right? No, it wasn't right. But how do you train against that? I don't know if you can in the context of a half a dozen folks getting shot and killed every night in a city that seems to have a serious problem about shootings in general. I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, and again, just imagine if you've seen so many African-American kids killed by other African-American kids, or even some African-American kids killing white kids and white kids killing black kids, and we can talk about the Bloods and the Crips and all the gangs and all that kind of stuff, and then you come into a bar, and if you don't see the security officer's uniform, or it's dark, or you already have an assumption that here is just another gangland execution, and you have this individual, and you don't know who he is, with a gun in the back of an individual, looking like he's about ready to pull the trigger, what do you do to prevent him from killing the person on the floor? You kill him. I have trouble justifying what happened, but I'm at least trying to put my head around, in light of what you just said, the set of circumstances that surround that particular action, which just, I think, once again, illustrates some of the things that David French says in his article here, and that is we ask a lot of cops. We ask them to shoot sometimes and not shoot other times. We ask them to make a split-second decision between whether or not this is a bad guy with even maybe a gangland execution, or whether it's a good guy with a gun. We're asking a lot, and I understand how it could have happened, and it's just a sad story, but maybe we can learn some lessons from it so that it doesn't happen to the rest of us. And it's interesting to have Robert say, I'm not even going to tell him I'm carrying a weapon. And I'd love to hear from some of you about that sometime as well. Let's take a break. We'll move on to a couple other topics. CNN next, right after this.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. pointofview.net/team. pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
So there's this guy named Jordan. He's a healthy guy. He's a dad of 6, and he works as a guide in Alaska. And he goes to the doctor, true story, he goes to the doctor and he's diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. And here's the thing, he had switched earlier from medical insurance to Medishare, where Christians share each other's medical bills. So the question for Jordan and his wife Jenny was, is this actually going to work?
Our medical bills exceeded $160,000. Medishare members shared all our bills.
And it was about more than just the money, too. This is a real community.
Medishare is a family, a group of people that stick with you through the hardest times of your life. I just don't know how I could have done it without Medishare.
It's so worth looking into. There's a reason this is growing so fast. So if you want to find out more, here is a number for you. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, I'd like to take on a couple of other issues before we run out of time. And, of course, we always have tomorrow to cover some of these other topics. Once again, maybe we'll learn some more. But one of the things I did want to talk about for just a minute is the lawsuit that CNN has brought against the White House, against the Secret Service, and a number of other individuals that are associated with that simply because of the decision by the White House to pull the press credentials of Jim Acosta. Okay. Now, the bottom line, I would say, before we even go further, is I think it's an overreaction from the Trump administration. You can agree or disagree on that. But the point I really want to focus our time and attention on is, does it violate the Constitution? Because the grandstanding, that's Sarah Sanders comment is that they're arguing that pulling Jim Acosta's press credentials is a violation of the First Amendment and a violation of the Fifth Amendment. Now, let's just think this through for just a minute. Then, by not letting him have press credentials, then that means that that's a violation of freedom of press and, of course, also due process. Well, just think this through for a minute. Then that would mean that anybody who doesn't have press credentials, or anyone who has press credentials declined, is going to actually be able to bring a lawsuit. Just think this through. It's the example I always like to use. That people say, well, wait a minute, they didn't let this book get into the local public bookstore, or they didn't put it in the library, or they didn't put this book in the school library. And I go, well, that means they censor me because none of my books are in the school library. None of my books are in the public library. Well, no. I mean, after a while, you sort of lose perspective here. The White House has the freedom within the venue where the newsroom is to decide who gets to be in and who does not get to be in. And those who get to be in are usually the mainstream press, those people that have a very significant number of viewers or readers. But they also allow some smaller organizations to come in there, but they don't let everybody in there because they need a building larger than Congress to get all of the possible reporters and internet reporters from there. So by definition, they can make a choice about who they want to bring in based upon anything from the size of the organization that they represent, or the size of the outreach of their organization, to even their behavior within that particular building. So that's where I would go. But nevertheless, I didn't want to talk much about this until I found out today that Fox News actually says now they're going to file a brief in favor of CNN. And at the same time, Bob Woodward has talked about this. So I thought, okay, I'm going to play it both sides. Let's hear from a conservative first. Mark Levin. Mark Levin, of course, has worked in the Reagan administration as a talk show host. And he said, I'm just going to give you a direct quote here. Mark Levin said, I just read CNN's lawsuit against the administration over Jim Acosta. It's a very weak case, but if they get before an Obama or Clinton district judge, who knows? CNN hired Ted Olson's firm, and he has signed on to the lawsuit. Olson was hired for a few reasons. First of all, as a former Reagan official and lawyer for Bush in the Bush-Gore, that would be the election in 2000. CNN hopes to make the PR case about this in a bipartisan manner. Number two, CNN hopes to make the PR case that it is upholding the Constitution against a rogue administration. And number three, CNN has employed a top Supreme Court litigator. So again, Ted Olson's on that side. So there's one way to go it. A little bit later, Mark Levin said this, quote, nevertheless, it's a ridiculous suit. CNN still has reporters at White House and in the presidential press conferences. Acosta does not have a constitutional right to be physically present in the press room any more than scores of media outlets do not. Acosta can watch the press conference from outside the White House grounds as they are televised. The president cannot be compelled by a court to actually call on any particular reporter during a press conference, and goes on to there. And you might remember, if you were listening here on Friday, one of the suggestions that Lathan Watts came up with is, he says, I think the better way to have handled that would be for the decision by Donald Trump just not to call on Jim Acosta any longer and just simply let him sit in the press room but never get called on. And after a while, I think CNN would say, you know, we need to put somebody else in there because he's the president is never going to call on Jim Acosta. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is never going to call on Jim Acosta. We're just wasting a seat. Let's get somebody else in there, and maybe CNN will get to ask a question. But that's not how they played it. But I thought it was interesting because, okay, Mark Levin, he's a conservative. Obviously, we knew what he was going to say probably before he said it. Bob Woodward. Okay, for those of you that are young kids, you might say, the name sounds familiar. Well, Woodward and Bernstein are the ones that broke the story of Watergate. And he is, by his own definition, a liberal progressive. Okay, but nevertheless, he criticized CNN's response to that, saying that the solution for CNN is not to file a lawsuit. I love what he says. It's to be more serious about your reporting. Oh, thank you, Bob Woodward. That was a great line. I thought that was good. Now, again, let me give you the whole quote here. He was at the Global Financial Leadership Conference in Naples, Florida. And in the news conference there, he says there's an emotional reaction to Trump. Too many people for Trump or against Trump has become emotionally unhinged. He said the remedy isn't a lawsuit. It's more serious reporting about what he's doing. And so that was picked up by a number of individuals. Woodward also went on to say, this is negative. Trump is sitting around saying this is great. When we engage in Trump's strategy, he's taking the bait. And again, like I said, the comment being made there is it isn't a lawsuit, which is the real remedy. It's to do more serious reporting about that. And, of course, the response that's come from Sarah Huckabee Sanders is simply that this is grandstanding. And nevertheless, this is going to be one where the White House says that they will vigorously defend the lawsuit. The only real surprise in all of this came today when Fox News President Jay Wallace said in a statement that the network would file an amicus brief at the U.S. District Court in the lawsuit. He said, quote, Fox News supports CNN in its legal effort to regain its White House reporter's press credential. We intend to file an amicus brief with the U.S. District Court. Secret Service passes for working White House journalists should never be weaponized. Okay, and of course they don't like the tone of the president, on and on. So that was kind of surprising to me. So nevertheless, the lawsuit is going forward and the briefs are going forward. Who else is filing them? Well, not surprising. NBC News is along with CNN, Associated Press, Bloomberg, Gannett, New York Times, Politico, USA Today, Washington Post are just a few of those that I have a list of that are filing the case. But I would simply make the argument that the First Amendment certainly gives you the right as a freedom of press to report what you want, but it doesn't give you a right to be in that room. If indeed you end up with a judge saying that, then how are you going to even limit it? Because the criterion that is used in this case is bad behavior, but the criteria, the various criteria, could be everything from favorable reporting from that news outlet, the size of the individuals that are being reached by that news organization in terms of viewers or listeners or readers. It could be a variety of different things. And when you all of a sudden tell the president of the United States that on his own land and in his own office and in his own room, he can't control what takes place there, is a bit much. Now, was it a bad idea from the Trump administration? I think so, but that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is the First Amendment doesn't guarantee Jim Acosta the right to have a press credential, especially if he wants to be obnoxious. And so that's where we find ourselves. Just before we take a break, though, I thought I'd also mention one of the other articles I've posted here, and it, I guess, is one that I will spend some time talking about after the break. But the article is the second article we've posted, and it just I think, was one of those logical conclusions, and that is, as Dennis Prager in his piece says, if sex isn't fixed, why is age? And so if it is okay that even though your birth certificate says you're male, and even if you have male parts, I'm trying to be careful here, and it shows that you are male on your birth certificate, you can still claim to be a female. So if I can change my gender, basically, why can't I change my age? And so when we come back from the break, I want to talk about this individual in the Netherlands. Why is it always some of the first social changes are always there in the Netherlands? But nevertheless, is petitioning a Dutch court to change his legal age, because after all, if I can change my birth certificate in terms of gender, why can't I change my birth certificate in terms of age? I don't think it's going anywhere, but you see that just certainly was one of those natural things that was going to plan out and probably unfold. So we'll get back to that and then get into a couple of other issues that I thought would be relevant as well. So we'll cover some of those topics. And again, if you'd like to join us on CNN or some of these other topics in this last segment, give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212. And if you find yourself saying, I really can't believe this one, I got to read it for myself, it's the second article we've posted on the website, pointofview.net. Come back and read it, and we'll finish off the day. All that coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1987, the Supreme Court was asked whether timbering operations within a national park over a portion of land traditionally used for religious purposes by Native Americans violated the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause. Justice O'Connor's opinion in Ling v. Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association concluded that, quote, whatever rights the Indians may have to the use of the land in question did not divest the government of its right to use what is, after all, its land, unquote. But not all the justices agreed. Justice Brennan, joined by Justices Marshall and Blackmun, disagreed. He reasoned that the timbering in question threatened the, quote, very existence of a Native American religion. He concluded on a somber note, quote, today the court holds that a federal land use decision that promises to destroy an entire religion does not burden the practice of that faith in a manner recognized by the Free Exercise Clause. I find it difficult, however, to imagine conduct more insensitive to religious needs, unquote. 13 years later, Congress would pass the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. At the least, RLUIPA would have required the government to demonstrate that its actions were the least restrictive in pursuit of a compelling government interest. RLUIPA, like RFRA, insists that government actions substantially burdening the free exercise of religion receive heightened scrutiny. That protects all of our religious liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, the second article we've posted here today, if you'd like to read it, If Sex Isn't Fixed, Why Is Age? I won't read all of it because I want to get to the other issue, this point-counterpoint battle between the President of France and the President of the United States. But let me at least mention a couple of comments from Dennis Prager, and you can read it in its entirety if you'd like to do so, because it raises a bigger question. On the one hand, it's an eye roller. Okay, a 69-year-old man wants to change his birth certificate so that it says instead of being 69 years of age, he's 49 years of age. And so he wants to be able to alter his birth certificate to show that he was born 20 years later. Now, you might say, well, okay, how does this happen? Well, he was born on the 11th of March, 1949, but he says he feels at least 20 years younger, wants to change the birth rate to 11th March, 1969. Why? Well, I thought it was interesting because this man said, I have done a checkup. What does it show? Well, my biological age is 45 years, so I'm 69, I'm limited. If I'm 49, I love this, then I can buy a house, drive a different car. I can take up more work. When I'm on Tinder and it says I'm 69, I don't get an answer. When I'm 49 with the face I have, I'll be in a luxurious position. So the point he's making is if you can change on your birth certificate your gender, because he actually says transgenders now can have their gender changed on their birth certificate, he argues. In the same spirit, there should be room for an age change. Now, I don't know if he's trying, since he's in the Netherlands and I don't speak Dutch, I don't know if he's just having fun with everybody or whether he's really serious about that or whether he's trying to point out something wrong with the gender fluidity argument. Don't know. But Dennis Prager spends some time actually at the end asking the question, well, why is this individual wrong then? He says the judges in the Netherlands will likely rule against him, but if they believe that sex has no objective reality, that sex on one's birth certificate can be changed, on what grounds can they rule that the date of birth cannot be changed? The answer is there's no such grounds, but only for the time being, because the day the New York Times publishes an article titled, "The Idea That a Person's Age is Determined by Their Date of Birth is Not True," that will become subjective. And so, if nothing else, it's an attempt to maybe, I'm not sure if it's on the part of the 69-year-old speaker in the Netherlands, but it's certainly used by Dennis Prager to say, once you head down this road, and we've talked about this before, once you say that gender is fluid, and essentially say gender and sex are the same thing, and you can say, okay, even if you are a male, but if you feel like a female, then you should be treated like a female. And even then, of course, if you are maybe actually going to go through surgery to complete that, then we should change your birth certificate, is the argument being made. And so now your assigned gender is female. Well, once you say we can change the birth certificate from male to female, again, the 69-year-old person in the Netherlands saying, well, then why can't I change my birth certificate to say I was born in March of 1969 instead of March 1949? Interesting, and I thought it would be at least something for you to read. Just before we wind down today, the counterpoint between the two presidents, President Emmanuel Macron, who's the French president, and, of course, our president, Donald Trump, had to do with this issue of whether or not nationalism and patriotism are the same things. Macron said the other day that patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is the betrayal of patriotism. By putting our interests first with no regard for others, we erase the very thing that a nation holds dearest and the thing that keeps it alive, its moral values. Well, Ben Shapiro talks about the fact that there have been times when nationalism has been opposed to patriotism, but most of the time and more currently, nationalism can stand up to international communism. Nationalism can refuse to bow before the dictates of multiculturalism, he says, which suggests that all cultures and practices are of equal value. He says patriotism, on the other hand, is a philosophy of national values. It is a statement that your nation has values that are eternal, true, and noble. And one of the arguments he makes is that American patriotism prizes God-given individual rights protected by limited government. And so what he really argues for is the opposite of nationalism then isn't patriotism, it's internationalism, or the idea that all human beings share similar values, and therefore borders and national interests are irrelevant. Now, the way I've dealt with it is, again, I think the president would be better if he thought of other ways to say this. But, again, once you say America first, that becomes identified as nationalism. But let's just think about this for a minute. I mean, you could say that Mahatma Gandhi was a nationalist. Does anybody think that he was, anti-India? If anything, he wanted India for the Indians. You could certainly have said I don't know, that Winston Churchill was a nationalist, although now some people think he's kind of evil, so maybe he doesn't work as well as I used to use as an example. But you can think of all sorts of people that would be considered to be nationalists, but in the same sense, we don't necessarily believe that those are individuals that are Nazis. So, let's kind of cool the rhetoric. And if nothing else, it's just another example of kind of a point-counterpoint happening between the president of France and the president of the United States. Of course, Macron went on to really kind of stick it in the eye of Donald Trump by saying that we need to actually build a French army to protect us from China, Russia, and even the United States. Really? You want to put the United States in the same category as China and Russia? I think that's what got Donald Trump and why the tweet war has continued to this very day. Let's take one more phone call real quickly. I did mention something about gender change. So, Michael, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Hello. I just figured if you can change your age, you can change your gender. What about changing your parentage? I mean, I honestly believe I am the grandson of Warren Buffett.
Well, then I think you deserve some kind of inheritance then.
Absolutely. I mean, I sincerely believe this. I think everybody ought to treat me that way anyhow.
I think you win the award for one of the better comments of the day. And of course, we've heard people say, well, if I'm a 7-foot Chinese woman, and all these other things that you've seen on the YouTube channels and things like that, it just illustrates that once you head down this road, people always say, don't use watershed arguments. Yeah, but sometimes you can see where the divide is. Once you start down this way, it just slipperily slides down that slope. And once you can change your gender, you can change your age. Now you want to change your income level, possibly, and your inheritance.
Parentage. Yeah.
So there
Insanity
you go.
in ad infinitum.
Yeah. Michael, appreciate that. I wish I had a little more time, but probably a good way to end. And again, if you find yourself saying, you got to be making this stuff up. I wish I were. And again, I don't know if the 69-year-old is just having fun at our expense, but nevertheless, he's actually petitioned the Dutch court to change his birth certificate to say that he's no longer born on the 11th of March, 1949, but the 11th of March, 1969. And there we go. Now, again, there's all sorts of jokes you could say about women that have changed their age over the years and changed their birth certificate and not told the truth about their age, but we will leave those for the table and cover those on another day. Let me just mention that tomorrow we're going to have all sorts of great conversation. We're going to talk about Ron Greer, who is man in the mirror, by the way, grew up in a segregated South, but also ran for Congress and now is working with a tremendous ministry to really encourage men. We'll be talking with him. Also have Ron Gregod talking about the Word, the history of the Bible, and how it came to us. And those will be encouraging. But in between, we'll get into all the other issues in the news. And every day, we just never seem to run out of things to talk about because of all the topics and issues in the news. We've done a pretty good job of covering them today. We'll do our best to cover some more tomorrow. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Visit our website, pointofview.net. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.